So there's a balancing act. In terms of how the NHS copes, obviously NHS funding has been reduced over time, and I think that had it happened in a situation where they'd had better funding, it obviously would have been easier for them to cope. So that's my take on that. In terms of how businesses cope, I think that's quite tricky to think about, because the Conservatives are obviously a lot more pro-business than Labour, but they also have this idea of a free market where everybody funds themselves. Not entirely, obviously, they're not completely to the right economically, but that they're more of that mindset than the Labour Party. However, the pandemic has meant that no one can fund themselves. So, and that's why furlough has kind of had to happen to keep small businesses and larger businesses afloat. I think that Labour would have granted more money to businesses because they're social, they're more socialist, and not completely socialist. They're a bit more right wing than that, but I'm so tentative using these terms because I'm worried that I'm going to get corrected. But basically, I think that if the Labour Party had been in that situation, they would have been more willing to grant more money. Perhaps taxes would have been increased to fund businesses and public. I don't know. That's not how taxes work, is it? But I do think that it would have been better funded for a longer period of time to help those businesses out, because obviously furlough's not really happening anymore and businesses are really, really struggling with that. The thing is, there's so many different elements to the pandemic that it's interesting to think about how it would have happened in a different time. Because obviously there's the technological communication aspect, which we're actually incredibly lucky to be living in this time. You know, obviously, you know, if holograms existed, it'd be even better, but I'll take Zoom for now. But then in terms of, you know, how the government have handled it, in terms of funding for public and private sector services, it's so variant depending on who's in power, and it's difficult to say, at least between the two Conservative governments, how differently it would have been handled. As I said, I think that they both have been indecisive in the past, so I actually don't think there'd be much to choose between them. I think in terms of how the creative industries have adapted, we once again are quite lucky in terms of technology. This means that choirs and things like that have been able to move over to Zoom or equivalent, which is amazing. Technology such as GarageBand has meant that virtual performances are able to be put together so that people can sing together in a way, even though it's not live, which I think is really powerful because it shows that music can carry on. And I do think that music is a powerful tool to motivate people and keep people feeling really happy. Other art forms have sort of moved over to Zoom, like artists have artists were already putting their work on social media before the pandemic even happened, and I think that has been massively helpful to sort of help their careers bloom. But actors have moved over to Zoom to put on shows and things like that, and I think that's really interesting. I think that sort of gives them a new way of developing their craft, I suppose, and I think that's really cool. However, obviously it's not what they signed up to do in the first place, but at least 2020/2021 has given them a platform to carry on doing what they love doing. So, yeah, I think that's my final thoughts. Generally, yeah, I'd say that in terms of communication and technology and creative industries, we're very, very lucky that the pandemic happened today and not in an earlier decade, because we have this technology to keep things moving as best as possible. In terms of government decision making and funding and things like that, who's to say? Like, I am biased. I am more of a Labour supporter than I am a Conservative supporter, so I do think that it would have been handled better 20 years ago than it has been in today's time, but who's to say? That's a difficult one to call.
Time for tea and talk.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. I know it was quite a short one, and it probably felt like a bit of a gap filler to you all, but I hope you enjoyed listening anyway. Next week should be back to a proper interview one, because I know that they're probably more popular with all of you than the ones where it's just me. And yeah, thank you very much, and I will hear you next time. Goodbye!
It's Wednesday at 11, so you know what that means. It's time for tea and talk.
Oh, what's that?
Bitch, please.